far away from my friend and relation, betrayed by the black velvet band.
Hello and welcome to the Shropshire Witches podcast. I'm Amy.
I'm Alix.
And today we have a very exciting episode, and it's somebody that I have been a very big fan of. I'm absolutely going to open up and tell you I'm an unrepentant fan. I love this woman. I think she's brilliant. And she's here today to talk a little bit about the medieval world, and we're going to have some really unexpected kind of twists and turns. So we're really excited to speak to Gemma Hollman. So say hello, Gemma.
Hello, thank you. My goodness, I'm so glad it's a podcast because you're making me blush.
Also, I realised then me saying "say hello, Gemma" sounded a bit like "do it," so I apologise there. But I think I'm getting all tongue twisted because I've been a fan for a very, very long time.
No, it's so lovely to finally chat to you. And, you know, as you say, we've sort of been chatting for years over social media. So it's so nice to sort of finally have a proper sit down conversation.
Yes, I'm very excited. So I think rather than me kind of giving you an introduction, it might be best for our listeners if you kind of give yourself a little introduction, particularly with regard to your work, your focus, and I think what I'm really interested to hear about is the inspiration behind it. So what made you, what was the thing that drove you to your field of research? What was that spark or the thing that inspires you?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a historian and author, and I specialise in sort of late medieval history, mostly women's history, particularly at the royal courts of England and France. I also run a history blog called Just History Posts, which I've run for quite a few years now. Don't quite know where the time's gone. But yeah, I sort of I kind of fell into it all really, where, you know, I've always really enjoyed history, and I decided to study it at university and really enjoyed it there, and sort of stayed on and did my master's. And that was kind of where I kind of got drew to the medieval period, where I've always enjoyed all aspects of history, and I still do. I still like learning about lots of different parts of history, and that's sort of I was sort of saying to Alix before we started recording, that's why I really enjoy running my blog, because I get to dip into other periods of history that I don't sort of write my books about. But when I was at university, I found that I really enjoyed writing medieval history more than I did other periods, just because I quite liked the challenge of the limited sources and trying to figure out what happened when you might only have like one chronicle account, or, you know, a handful of sort of government documents that survive, as opposed to, you know, the modern period where sometimes you've got too many sources. And, you know, that idea that you could maybe read everything there was to read and try and draw something, rather than going, oh well, maybe I should just read one more thing, like you do with modern history. But, you know, I've always enjoyed women's history. I've always been very drawn to it. You know, as a woman myself, it's always very interesting kind of trying to find yourself in history and imagine what your life might have been like if you were born in a different time period and things like that. But particularly at university, as I said, you know, doing medieval history and suddenly finding out about all of these amazing medieval women who were around, where, you know, at sort of school, you're kind of taught that basically, you know, women didn't exist until the Tudors, and then suddenly we had some women monarchs, and, you know, they did some stuff and were great. And, you know, you just get this idea that women didn't really do anything in the medieval period, and they were just there to make babies. And, you know, you learn about 1066 and all of that, and that's kind of it. And then, you know, suddenly I was in these lectures and I was hearing about people like Isabella of France, who was the wife of King Edward II, and finding out that she led a coup against her husband and then basically ruled the country by herself with her lover for several years. And I was just like, how have I never heard of this woman? Like, I didn't know anyone got overthrown, let alone, by his wife kind of thing. And, you hear about other figures, like, some of the really important nuns and mystics, and, everyone knows about people like Joan of Arc, but, hearing sort of other similar people. And I was just like, wow, there's all of these stories here that I never knew about. And, being passionate about history, I'd come home and I would tell all of my friends and family about all the people I was learning about, and I'd be like, did you know about this, and did you know about that? And yeah, it all kind of grew out of there. I mean, my first book, Royal Witches, grew out of my master's dissertation. And that was very much a case of finishing university, coming home, talking to people, sort of, as I said, friends and family, but people I worked with and stuff like that. And people would always ask, as they do, oh, well, what was your dissertation on? And I'd tell them, and they'd be like, oh my God, like, that would make an amazing book, or like a really cool film. Like, that's insane. I've never heard about that. And, I heard that quite a few times. And I did a few blog posts on a couple of the women, and they were super popular blog posts. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe there is an appetite for people learning about these women that they didn't know about. And, I know about them, so why don't I give it a go? And yeah, it all just kind of went from there, really.
And that's brilliant. And I think we'll definitely be on the subject of the Royal Witches in a little while, because that was something that was my eureka moment, because I hadn't heard of them prior to some of your posts and your book. So again, I think I very much resonate with what you said there about kind of studying history, being taught about 1066 and all that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden there's these women in the medieval period. It wasn't just, men with swords. And I think that's the thing that really shines through, is the passion I think you have towards medieval women.
Yeah, definitely. As you say, that kind of thing of, women weren't invented in 1927, or they were always there, and they did things. And also, I think something that I've been leaning into more recently as well, particularly with my latest book, which looks at women from all levels of society during the medieval period, is it's so great to hear about these incredible sort of trailblazing women who did all of these things and defied convention. But I'm also increasingly drawn to the women who didn't necessarily do that, the ordinary women, or even the extraordinary women who did fit in with the sort of social norms of their time. And Queen Philippa of Hainault, who's in my second book, she was lauded at the time for basically being the perfect medieval queen. She was beyond reproach, and she had lots of children, and she didn't get involved in politics, and she was very pious and very generous and interceded for the poor and needy, and there was no more perfect woman than her, and in lots of ways that's also just as interesting, of sort of seeing the women who did kind of conform to those things, and how did they navigate society, and how were they successful in how contemporaries viewed them as well. And I just think there's such a big wealth of stories out there that women's history is such a growing field, and it has been for quite a few years. And so you are getting more variety of stories as well, which is really interesting, to have some of those, that you don't have to be an extraordinary earn a book. We've got lots of books about very mediocre men, and let's get some more women in there too.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, the kind of the mediocrity of some men, and certainly ones where their reputations really have kind of held fast for centuries, and sometimes it seems a little bit perplexing as well. One thing I did think was really interesting, out of an abundance of interesting things that you've written about, was also coming into modernity, was writing about the late Queen as well, Elizabeth II, before she became Queen. And that is a blog post I read, and I thought maybe we could talk about that afterwards as well, because I do think that is fascinating. Because, of course, we forget sometimes, we are obviously, women in the modern world is a very present thing, and, the inequality and things like that. But I think the Queen was this kind of steadfast figure for most of us, or a lot of us, for almost an entire lifetime in a way. I mean, I know there's still people around that I remember her father, but it's pretty far and few between, I think, these days. And so I'm interested to kind of look at her in how much the world changed during her reign as well. So if that's something we could talk about afterwards in terms of a more modern queen, I'd be fascinated by that as well.
Me too.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I was actually talking about this with my partner a couple of weeks ago, because with Queen Elizabeth II, I think you get a real insight into past queens, like, for example, Elizabeth I, who did reign for so long that, as you say, the majority of people in the country would have only known her in their lifetime. And you do get that idea of how it is a constant and the change that they oversee. And the reason it had come up in conversation was because I was in a park in London and there was this really pretty blossom tree, and I was taking a picture of it, and I saw the plaque at the bottom, and it was like, oh, this was planted for Queen Elizabeth's coronation and 1952 kind of thing. And I was like, oh yeah. And then it's like sort of hit me of like, oh yeah, like no wonder that tree's so big, because like that's well over 70 years ago now. But you just kind of don't think about that, because it still feels so recently that she died, and you do think about the things that she oversaw and the changes, and yeah, it does give you that insight as to why steady, long-living monarchs were so valuable in the past as well, and sort of how they were able to steer the country through things, and how it's the only thing that people did know.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you think sometimes in some cases, and I know I'm saying we'll talk about this afterwards, we kind of maneuver just talking about it now, but I think in terms of when some of these monarchs go from, and it's interesting because obviously, of course, Queen Victoria, likewise, these young women coming to the throne that then are surrounded by men in kind of seniority who are a bit sort of like, there, dear, thinking that these women are kind of, I would argue, definitely more malleable than, of course, they actually are, and are underestimated. And it's interesting, by the end of their reign, are they considered almost like paperweights, and I think there was a source that described Queen Victoria before her son Bertie obviously came to the throne, described her as a sort of as a paperweight that had been lifted by the time that she passed away. I'm not convinced that the late Queen Elizabeth had that. I think she stayed, and I'm not particularly a royalist, but I think she stayed in our affections in a way that perhaps somebody, I mean, there must have been people, of course, that still thought like Queen Victoria, but I think Elizabeth II, I'd be interested to know what her historical kind of equivalent might be, in terms of she did seem to stay in our affections in a way that even her son, I know there's been a lot of scandal, but even in his sort of short reign, these things, doesn't carry the same vigor, charisma, all these things. And he does a lot for the environment. We know this, and charities and things. There's something that was almost kind of, without coining a kind of cheesy phrase, sort of quite ethereal or magical about Elizabeth II, that kind of put her in, even people like I say, like myself, who are not royalists, implanted in our affections right till she passed. And it wasn't an untimely death. She was a big age, but we still felt almost a little bit sort of robbed of a figurehead, really. And I think it was interesting, this fact that there was a son just behind that maybe wasn't going to be, that was more of an understudy than a replacement, I think. Is that a bit brutal?
No, definitely. I mean, I think, I agree completely. Obviously there are lots of critics of the monarchy in this country, but as you say, there's a lot of people who might not like the monarchy or might be ambivalent towards the monarchy, who still really appreciated and respected Queen Elizabeth II. And I think there's quite a few reasons for that. I mean, I think anyone can appreciate, as you say, she was so young when she came to the throne, and she knew from a very young age that she was probably going to take to the throne. And so, she has that kind of lifetime of sacrifice kind of thing, and, obviously has a very cushy life and lots of luxuries and things. But, I think people appreciate that she did dedicate herself to the job, and she filled it to the best of her ability. And, having a neutral figurehead in a time of fraught politics, I think there's something very appealing of that, of having someone who's there who is sort of above politics and isn't involved in it, that can kind of gather people around and everything. And I think she knew the game, and she knew how to speak and act and be witty, and how to dress and how to behave, and this is all things that we've seen throughout history of sort of good and bad monarchs and sort of towing the line of your behavior. And it's something that the medieval queens would have to negotiate as well. And I think there was very much as well that kind of grandmotherly figure of because of her age, and because of the fact that she's the same age as people's grandparents or older. I think it was also that connection to that older generation and that kind of nostalgic view of the war generations who got on things, and they're stoic and they can't be shaken, and they're of a different era. And I think you kind of lose something of that when she died. And obviously, as you say, Charles is still quite elderly himself and is also of a sort of grandfather age and things, but I think because he's always been the son, there's that kind of more childlike thing attached to him, and there's a lot more people who are alive now who sort of grew up being the same age as him, or maybe sort of like 10 years younger or so. And so I think they kind of see him much more as an equal, seeing him growing up, seeing him navigating relationships and things like that you kind of miss out with the Queen as well. And so I think it is really interesting sort of how she did manage to pull things together. And especially, she wasn't a stranger to scandal herself. There's the sort of annus horribilis kind of thing. And the 90s and all the stuff with Princess Diana and everything was damaging, but she did kind of weather that storm and become that figure. And things like during COVID and with the death of Prince Philip and that kind of real poignant funeral, and she's sitting there by herself mourning her husband.
The photograph,
of so many years. And I think that was very humanizing for a lot of people as well, and that kind of idea that despite the completely different lives she led from other people, that people could relate to her in that moment, I think was quite powerful as well.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. And I think it's such an interesting slant on the Charles kind of scenario as well. Like, he was always the son and things. So he's a man, he's in his 70s, isn't he? So it's extraordinary. And of course, with Prince Philip as well, you sort of, or maybe kind of our generations, and look at that sort of steadfast marriage. But actually, of course, there's things like the Profumo affair, and there were lots of things that went on back in the day in the 60s, 70s, that were really pretty scandalous. And I suppose she had some way of kind of riding through that. I think that's really fascinating. But sorry, Amy, I'm hogging a bit. I bet you've got some questions, and I'm kind of
it's really interesting to listen to, because I know it sounds stupid, but I never really considered Elizabeth. She's always just, I think, because she was always a very tangible presence in our lives prior to her death, obviously. I never really considered her significant culturally, or the idea of her being quite a human monarch. So I think it's really interesting to drag me out of the medieval a little bit and hear that. So I was very interested. I didn't feel like I was not getting the questions. But what I would like to maybe build upon a little bit is the idea of medieval women, and I suppose you could say arguably even up until more modern times, being left out of historical narratives. So most of us have grown up, even though we are women, all of us on the podcast today are women, without really a good knowledge of certainly medieval historical narratives regarding women. We might know that Eleanor of Aquitaine was very beautiful, or things like that, but very, very little. So what do you think would be perhaps the most surprising thing to someone who isn't familiar with the medieval period about medieval women?
I think that probably the most surprising thing is the amount of freedom that they had and the amount of choices that they had. I think particularly in modern recent years, that a lot of our popular understanding of the medieval period is shaped by fantasy, because fantasy is pretty much always set in medieval or medieval style type thing. And you've got things like Game of Thrones or even like Lord of the Rings and things
Yeah.
is kind of medieval-esque, and you have all of these things, and so you kind of attach the values and stories that they give to things. So you have this idea that it's dark and grey and grim, and there's wars all the time, and it's brutal and it's violent, and women are oppressed and they are victims in these stories. And that is where a lot of people get their ideas from, and certainly for many years that's also the stories that were portrayed at school, in history books and textbooks and things like that. And yeah, as we said, the focus is often on battles and dates and sort of all of that. You've got the world wars, you've got the 1066, like we said, you'll have things like the Magna Carta, and so it's all very much male focused, and so it does kind of exclude the women. And so you just sort of, even if you're not explicitly taught that, the fact that they're absent in what you're learning, you kind of just assume, okay, well, they weren't doing much, they were there just to get married and have babies. But actually that's not quite the case. And history isn't linear. We didn't start from a base point and things have got better and better and better over time on an upwards trajectory. People have rights and technologies increase and then they get lost and come up again. So it's more of a kind of roller coaster type graph thing. And the medieval period, certainly in Europe, for lots of people was very much a high, that actually women's rights kind of got curbed a little bit as you started to go into the Tudor period and the early modern period, and actually in a lot of ways medieval women did have a lot more freedom. And it's not like it was a utopia. They were sort of seen as inferior to men generally, and they didn't have the same equal rights and equal opportunities and equal pay and things like that, but they were very much valued, and they had a lot of options. Peasant women, as time went on and cities developed and trades and crafts developed, there are women who are getting involved in that. They're joining the professional classes, they are learning trades, they are trading, they're making their own money, they're acting as independent women in lots of countries, and they've got lots of opportunities there. And whilst in sort of southern Europe there is very much an expectation that women stay in the home until marriage, and they're getting married in their teens and that's it. For most of sort of North and Western Europe, it's actually a very different story, and women are generally getting married in their late 20s, and it's the average marriage age is not very dissimilar to what it is today, and so these women are allowed to leave the home and live by themselves, or live with other people and have a job and have a life before choosing to marry and settle down and things like that. And as religion develops and you get an increase in nunneries and monasteries and things like that, you have a huge explosion in women choosing to be religious figures as well. Again, it's not something that women are forced into, or they're an inconvenient woman so we'll hide her away in a nunnery. Nuns were highly respected, and religious women could hold a huge amount of power. Like these mystics, they had books written about them and people were reading what they were saying, and people would come from all over Europe to travel to go and see these women and listen to what they had to say, and kings and emperors would ask for their advice. So they are respected, they hold a different role in society and they have different expectations, but that doesn't mean that they are less valued. And I think that's really, really interesting, and it's something that I really had my eyes open when I was researching my latest book, Women in the Middle Ages, of seeing just how many options they did actually have in many cases.
I think that's oh god, sorry Alex.
No, I was gonna say exactly the same thing, that I think that's just really extraordinary. There was a particular person I was interested in asking about, but Amy, were you going to go in as you got a question?
I was just going to say, I think that's really interesting, because even today, even now, when we look at kind of some popular media and things like that, we're still fed the idea of the kind of well-behaved housewife or handmaiden or those kind of things, and there's so many more nuances to medieval women. And if you don't mind, I was wondering who you thought maybe typified that idea of the medieval woman in reality, of those opportunities and those experiences. For me, I know it's fictional, but I always think of the wife of Bath, and her experiences and how she typifies that experiences. But who would you kind of say is a good example of that?
Oh gosh, that's really hard.
Yes, sorry.
So many people, really. I mean, I think, one woman that's always so interesting to me is Alice Perez, who was the mistress of Edward III, and is the mistress in my second book, The Queen and the Mistress. And I think her story is really emblematic of 14th century England, because it's such a century of change. And this is a time where European population is at its peak. There's the most amount of people living in Europe. You then sort of have that completely decimated by the Black Death that breaks out, and possibly up to half or maybe even more of Europe gets completely wiped out from that. And then you have all of the fallout of society from that. In England in particular, you've had this growing mercantile class, and London sort of really growing, and these new opportunities where, before you kind of had the church, the nobles and the peasants, but now you're having this mercantile bourgeois class kind of developing in places like London, where they're skilled professionals who are making a lot of money, and so they're able to influence things like government, but people aren't quite sure what to do with them because they're not nobles, and it should be people of noble blood and God chosen people who are ruling things. And Edward's court had always been a thing where people could work their ways up the ranks by proving themselves. And obviously for men, that's mostly going out to fight in all of Edward's wars and proving themselves as good fighters, and then sort of coming back and working in the courts and giving money to the regime. But there's not necessarily the same options for women. But Alice really kind of straddles that. And, she's born into a London goldsmith family. So she's already got this completely different childhood that didn't really exist in centuries before, of, this kind of half privileged life in London, where she probably had some luxuries. She probably was educated to an extent. And so she's really on the cusp of this change. And she's probably born, a few years before the Black Death hits. So she'll have sort of survived that and gone through all of that. And then, eventually finds her way to court and sees these amazing things going on at court that were, would have been beyond any luxuries she had known before, and getting to know all of the most powerful men in Western Europe, and then rising to the top herself and being able to influence things and having people come to her, men from all over Europe. The Pope writes to her at one point asking for her help, and she's just this woman, and one of the most powerful people in this Christendom, the sphere of Christendom, is writing to her. And so she's really kind of straddling all of these changes that are going on in that century. And I think it's just such a really interesting case study to see that. And obviously it's a very exceptional circumstance, but there would have been lots of other women who had similar stories of growing up in these urban centers and witnessing these changes and these luxuries, and finding ways to carve out power for themselves in untraditional ways.
She is fascinating. I do agree with you there, and I think she's a very good example of what you were kind of discussing and bringing to the discussion about medieval women in general and that development. So that's really interesting. I don't know if Alix has any more questions about medieval women in general.
None. No, that's it. Nothing to ask.
Done.
No, 100%. Always, yeah.
I didn't want to move on before I asked you. Yeah.
You never need to ask that. I think we always know they are like, yeah, here's 20. No, honestly, I've got a list here longer than the Doomsday Book, but I've got to ask you, actually, somebody I am fascinated by, and if I said to you the female chaucer, I think instantly who I'm going to say. Julian of Norwich. I am fascinated. And if you could talk about her life in isolation, her role being basically walled up for decades. Could you just tell us a little bit about that and her role? And it's fascinating, and I'd love to hear it from you, because this is going to be very much your area. But just looking at, somebody on the other side of the kind of medieval women, she has to be one of the most fascinating. And often I'm always amazed, not that known by a lot of people, which I find extraordinary.
Yeah. I mean, Julian certainly had a really interesting life, and actually, having spoken about Alice Perez, their lives overlapped. They're born probably in the same decade, and so they're very much alive at the same time, and sort of talking about Alice being a mistress, and then Julian's kind of very much on the other side of the coin there. But yeah, she was a really famous anchoress. And anchoresses themselves are just really interesting, where it was it's sort of a group of religious women who would get attached to a church, and as you say, they would be bricked up in these cells. They were sort of called, and they're normally only a couple of meters by a couple of meters, and they would be attached to a church, bricked up, and to all intents and purposes for society, they were effectively dead. Part of the ritual of bricking up an anchoress, they would be sort of sprinkled with dust, and that's the kind of representation of like you have died kind of thing. And they're very much dedicating their lives to God in a very extreme way, obviously, even more so than nuns. And their names come from the fact that they were viewed as anchors to the church. There's some very early writings in sort of 12th, 13th centuries talking about this, saying that these women will act as anchors for their church, and the idea is that they are so holy that they've chosen to live this life where they are just being bricked up. They will spend their whole days praying, reading the Bible, but also dispensing wisdom to people. So these anchoresses, they would have windows, because obviously they needed food passed to them, they needed to be able to speak to the outside world so that the priests could say mass to them, and so from these windows they would also dispense advice, and people would come to them to hear them speak, get their advice. And they were really, really important parts of society. And, if there were times of distress, then monarchs would often pay for anchoresses to say prayers for them, because their prayers were sort of seen to have really strong currency. But the thing that's interesting with Julian as well is that she's very much following this emerging trend of religious women who haven't necessarily originated from a religious background, so from a nunnery, and as the 1300s, 1400s go on, you have much more of this lay movement of religiosity, and you have in parts of Europe you have the Beguines, who again, they're women who are gathering together. They're not nuns, they haven't taken vows, but they want to live in communities of women, and they want to dedicate themselves to charity and live poor, simple lives and dedicate themselves to God, but in a way that's outside of an institution. And so you do have lots of these people who sort of have these sort of midlife revelations, basically, and that's very much something that Julian experiences, where she's really sick, she thinks that she's going to die, and then she has these visions and she sort of miraculously recovers, and that kind of changes the course of her life, and yeah, she's so interesting. And a lot of these anchoresses and mystics as well, who are sort of these religious women who receive visions, their writings become really popular, and if they're literate, they're encouraged to write down the visions that they have. If they're not literate, then priests will be assigned to them to help them write them down, because it's thought that these visions come from God, come from heaven, and so people want to know what God is saying and how they can improve themselves and how they can understand their religion more. And Julian is very much on the same thing. She has her writings, which I think are sort of some of the earliest sort of works by a woman in England, and yeah, it's so important. And as you say, it's interesting how lots of people do know about her, but also lots of people don't know about her when she was so famous during her lifetime and afterwards, and her works did circulate and are still in circulation today.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And do you, I've got to ask, just I suppose, from a kind of for something physical to see, do you know any examples of anchorite cells that you can see? Because I think there's one in Brighton in Shropshire, but do you know any that have got sort of particularly good examples, or somewhere you've been that you could say go and see it because it's fascinating?
No, I haven't actually been to see any. I mean, I know that over times I've seen things sort of pop up on social media, and I've been like, oh, that's really good, I should write that down. And then, but no, I mean, as you say, there are definitely some that do survive, and it's really interesting to go see them, because it is really hard to imagine just how tiny these cells were, and that, you know, it is just very much just a space to sit and sleep and eat and not do much else, and these sort of very bare walls. But you know, there are lots of surviving drawings as well in manuscripts and things like that, of these. And actually in my latest book, which is an illustrated history, there's quite a few great images of anchoresses and these sort of just these women's heads sticking out of windows and being bricked up by bishops and everything. And so I think they're really interesting to see as well, because again, that, you know, they're lovely pictures, as I said, you know, some of them are really great, but also you know, the fact that there are so many images, you know, again reminds us how important these women were. You know, they were important enough to be written about and to have pictures done of them, and yeah, they really were very important. And it, you know, it kind of goes back to what we were saying before when you were asking about, you know, what might surprise people about the period is how revered and respected they were. And especially, you know, this is a time where in most of Europe, you know, Catholicism is the dominant religion, and it's obviously a patriarchal religion. You know, women do not hold official positions high up in the church. They're not allowed to be priests or bishops or archbishops or the Pope, and yet being a religious woman, you could still have so much respect. You know, you have people like Hildegard von Bingen, who's a German nun, sort of similar vein of Julian of Norwich. And, you know, the Pope literally commands her to write down her visions, because he's like, wow, this is the real deal. You know, I want to know what she says. And, you know, you've got the Pope asking a woman to write about religion. And so, you know, these are no small things. And it's very much a way that women could get that respect by sort of claiming this direct line to heaven and to God.
It's fascinating. And the thing is, another thing I find in terms of normalizing something that is so, I suppose, bizarre to us, because just the extreme ability to be in those cells, but to have that familiarity that, in fact, if they did have drawings that maybe in some points even maybe not marginalia, but, you know, like kind of almost some of them might be the equivalent of like Penny Dreadful drawings, you know, like these glorious kind of, I know that's Victorian, but thinking like the medieval sort of like almost like cartoonesque, but you could draw these and sort of satirize these women and bishops and things like that. It's amazing that they were so well known that you could do that, and that would be in the vernacular in a way. People would just see it and know instantly what it was, and yet for something so extreme, it hasn't kind of traversed through the centuries in terms of a lot of people will never have heard of anchoresses or that was a thing, and would be sort of almost mortified, quite rightly, at the thought of it, because obviously there's lots of old houses where people say, oh, somebody was, you know, mistress or someone was bricked up and all these things, and a lot of the time it's a myth. But the fact that these women actually lived like that by consent and looking through these little windows and things is just utterly extraordinary, isn't it? And the fact that it become maybe not commonplace, but had been normalized enough that they were depicted with a familiarity in art, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, as you say, it is really interesting how they were so prevalent and famous, and then it did sort of drop off, and that most people don't know about them now. And yeah, just that sort of loss of that cultural memory in a way.
Yeah. It's bizarre, isn't it? And even kind of like Marjorie Kemp in a sort of Miss Havisham-esque get up, like it's just
I love
she had a whole horde. I don't know what the collective noun is, but like there was a lot of kids, but like it's her sartorial choice. I just think that a lot of these medieval women are sort of grouped into basically, I suppose, look like women today in terms of, they're like gauged on how hot somebody is or whatever, and it's ridiculous, it's ludicrous, but the kind of the depth of character that these women had, the talent, the intelligence, and the sort of the kind of strength of character, Julian case in point, and like that these women, like they get overlooked, they're forgotten, they're eclipsed, left the peace for a time by as you say, the kind of men, and not all men, but a lot of men that were really sort of dull by comparison.
Yeah.
I know you enjoyed that, Amy.
I did, yeah. You are right.
but yeah, I mean, I do think that's one of the things that is changing, because I think part of that is, it's not like we didn't know about these women. These women are people where we have loads of surviving manuscripts of their writing. It's how we know how popular they were, because you've got so many copies of their books still survive today and everything. And people are writing about them in chronicles and in local government records. So it's not like these are kind of rediscovered women where there's like one tiny source somewhere that mentions it and we've kind of found out about someone. But it's very much a reflection of the fact of that kind of Victorian idea of history is war and politics, and and great men doing great deeds, and that was what they were interested in, and so that's what they wrote history books about, and so that did eclipse women who had social influence in other ways, because they didn't really care about writing about the nuns who were doing all these things and influencing people in different ways, even when those nuns were influencing the same men, kind of thing, and giving these kings and emperors advice and things like that. And I think that's definitely something that's been changing in recent years as people do become more interested in social history. There's a lot more of an appetite for reading about these people, and so more and more books are coming out. And I do think that is something that is changing, and so that naturally gives these women a bit more time in the spotlight, which is great as well. And I think the next step that I'd like to see is more integration of that history. So my next book, which I'm currently working on, is a slight departure from my previous ones, in that it's focused on Richard II, which is obviously a man, a king, but the idea is that it's not just a straight biography of him. It's a look at his court and all of the players there, and he had a very female dominated court. His mother had a lot of influence, particularly when he was a young king in his minority. His wife had a lot of influence. There was lots of very important women at the court. He initiated lots of women to the Order of the Garter, and so there are all of these people here. And I think for a long time we had all of the men's history, and then a load of women's history got written as a kind of kickback of saying, no, look, all these women existed as well. And I think going forwards it would be so interesting to have more integrated histories of history of both of them together, because that's something that really struck me when I was researching my second book, and I was researching Queen Philippa of Hainault, who was Edward III's queen. And, I'd get out these big, huge, chunky biographies of Edward that were, 500, 600, 800 pages long. So big, chunky things. And, I'd flip straight to the index to see, right, where's Philippa mentioned? Where can I find her? And there would maybe be a handful of references, and most of it was, and then, then Philippa gave birth, and then she did this, and then, you'd have like the really famous intercession that she does outside of Calais. And then that was it. And I was like, well, they were married for 40 years. They were together almost all the time. She traveled with him. She went to the front line of his wars with him. She went into Scotland and was, in castles and helping with sieges. And she was in Calais. The reason she was in Calais is she was there camping out for months with Edward as he was besieging Calais. And, she helped in government. She helped to run things when he was gone, and she helped run council meetings and things like that. And she was doing things, but you would read these books of Edward and you would think that she didn't exist apart from to pop up every now and then to pop a child out of her, you know. And so I think sort of having some of these histories where actually you've got them side by side and recognize the influence that the women had over their men and over their courts as well, I think is a really interesting next step, so that to find out about Richard II's reign, you don't have to read a book about Richard II and then read a book about his mother Joan of Kent and then read a book about his wife and then kind of piece the bits together yourself. That actually you can have something that does that already, because obviously, you know, these periods were not seen in isolation. You know, if we're sort of going back to our earlier conversations, it'd be like reading a book about Elizabeth II and then Prince Philip turns up when he gets married and when he dies. You'd be like, well, that's not, you know, how things went. You know, he was there too, he was doing things, and he was in the Navy, and, you know, he was at all these political meetings as well and these balls and things, and you'd think that something was missing. And, you know, the same goes for medieval history.
Do you think, and that's fascinating, because again, previously when you mentioned the Victorians, that narrative, which again, probably a bit like the Tudors of the propaganda, the Victorians seem to have this masterful way of even how we look at certain buildings and the colour of Tudor buildings and things like this. You know, they sort of dictated a whole change in history as to we now see it. So, and maybe for a long time it was also Shakespeare with the play, you know, so the Sceptred Isle, you know, you're talking about Richard II. So if you're looking at that with the John of Gaunt speech, it's interesting. So as these things are, maybe, I don't know, because it was a long time since I've been at school, but I understand quite a lot of that sort of thing is maybe not taught as it once was. And so at one point, a lot of the histories and particularly how women, more so men, were seen with things like the narrative of Shakespeare and that type of thing. And as that changes again, and we're looking at the narrative of women, so maybe constantly it's mercurial, these things are changing, but it's interesting. So, you know, like when we were growing up, Anne Boleyn was the femme fatale. Well, that's starting to change. And then you look at Catherine Aragon with her ability as a leader, coming from, you know, the family that she came from, and her intelligence, all this sort of thing. And especially Anne Boleyn as well, being, you know, with polyglot, this kind of thing, all coming to the forefront in a way that it never was, because Catherine of Aragon was painted as the frumpy queen. I'm just thinking of kind of two very famous queens. Anne Boleyn as the kind of the sexy mistress. These things are starting to change, and they're looking like, you know, we spoke, Gemma, actually about the brilliant Tracy Borman. She's looking at the relationship between mother and daughter, even though they parted very young. And it's fascinating, all these things that are starting to change as obviously as society changes and what our appetite for what we want to know changes, and maybe our kind of appetite for intense battle knowledge or that kind of narrative may be changing. Maybe now when we look at villains, and even the way we look at villains, we look at them as flawed characters and they've had troubled childhoods, and we tend to make them more complex rather than just someone being a villain, you know. So maybe that kind of is cometh the hour, cometh the, I was going to say woman actually, because this idea of women coming to the forefront and going, they're not just baby makers, they're not just attractive or whatever, is fascinating. And I'm interested what you think maybe the next step would be, and also the role of it for people that aren't historians like yourselves, who aren't, you know, because the level of research and skill that goes into the work that you do is, I imagine, is not underestimated by a lot of people. They don't realize probably just how much people like yourselves do and how long you spend researching to know what you know. It's really impressive. I'm interested how that comes into the day-to-day life, because obviously schools and things like that, or just in terms of what we see on television, the arts, you know, what do you think there is that we could be doing kind of day to day to bring things like that to the forefront, to educate people about people like Julian of Norwich, all these things, that there's a whole generation of people that won't know about this sort of thing, that maybe could be exposed to it in new and interesting ways?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the internet and all the media that's come with that has been a really great way of that, because, you know, previously the media that people could consume would be books, but you have to be someone who is wanting to sit down and read a history book, which is already a narrower set of people, or people will consume through television or obviously sort of films as well. But that's very much dictated to you of what people have decided to commission and have decided is profitable, and it's still a very narrow list. And, you know, you have people like Dan Snow and stuff talking about this, where you know, it's still, if it's not the Tudors, and it's not, you know, maybe a couple of ancient things, you know, the ancient Egyptians or something like that, or the world wars, then TV companies don't want to know. They don't want to take those risks and invest those money, because the people at the very top making those decisions don't necessarily know about other histories, and they don't know that people are very interested in them. And it's quite striking, really, because the few things that do slip through shows the appetite. You know, if we go back to things like Game of Thrones, you know, it's very well known that a lot of inspiration from that comes from the Wars of the Roses. And, you know, The White Queen was such a very popular series, you know, both the books by Philippa Gregory, but, you know, obviously got made into a TV series, which was wildly popular. And so you have these two things that are both wildly popular and shows, hey, people are interested in the Wars of the Roses. But you then try and get a documentary or another type of show about it, and suddenly there aren't any, because people don't want to take that risk. You know, I actually know someone who commissioned, who sort of made TV programs for many years, and you know, he did some history documentaries and things, and you know, he said the exact same thing. He said there was a list of 6 topics that people would commission about history, and if it wasn't those 6, it doesn't matter how interesting the story was or how much evidence you had that people were interested, they wouldn't do it. Whereas with the internet, things are a lot more accessible to people. You know, they can watch YouTube videos, they pop up on TikTok or on Instagram Reels, and you know, even if you're not following history accounts, there'll be things that pop up, and people are doing it in fun and interesting ways. Like I'm terrible, I cannot remember his name now, but there's a guy on Instagram whose reels always pop up, and he does sort of short, like, comedy skits to do with history, and they're so funny, and you know, if you know bits of the history, like, they're so well researched, and you know, knows the material so well, but you don't feel like you're having a lesson thrown at you, kind of thing. And that even if it's a period that you don't really know, you can kind of learn a bit from these short skits, kind of thing. And I think that acts as an entryway for people at a much earlier age than before, because, you know, one of the things that I did always find, again, whilst I was at university and studying, and I'd come home and I'd talk to, like, my parents' friends, and they'd, you know, I'd say I was doing history at university, and literally, like, 99% of the time they would respond, oh, you know, I hated history at school. I thought it was so boring. But now that I'm older, I absolutely love it. And I think that's such a common experience of history at school does tend to be really dry, really repetitive, really focused on facts. And it's only when people become older and a bit more free to consume the media that they want to, that they realize how interesting it is, and that it doesn't have to be like that. And I think now with things like podcasts, you know, podcasts have exploded in popularity, but yeah, podcasts, TikTok, YouTube, like, there's ways for that to happen at a much earlier age now. So you've got people in their 20s and their 30s who are also going, oh, wow, actually, yeah, history is interesting. And, you know, if I'm interested in this one really obscure thing of history, I can now just Google it, and I can read the Wikipedia page about it, and I can find a blog that's spoken about it, and I can see, you know, I can go down this YouTube rabbit hole and come out 10 hours later knowing about, like, this one tiny Roman town and the lead pipes that they used for their plumbing, and, you know, all of that. And so it's a lot easier for people to come across those things and then have that as the gateway into finding out more things.
It's funny because I used to hate history when I was at school. I used to be a history teacher, and that was the number one thing a parent would say to me at parents' evening was, I used to hate history at school, but now I like it because of, and then insert random Wikipedia or thing that they'd searched online. And certainly I think you've just described my average Friday night when you said about going down a YouTube and Wikipedia 10-hour.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, why do I know about this now? Yes, hyper-focusing to the absolute extreme. But I think what you're saying is completely true. And it's that accessibility that I think actually is allowing so many more people to realise what they are interested in, and also that it's a viable piece of history. Because certainly when I was doing my history degree, it was there's good history and then there's not history. That's not worth studying. Why are you studying that? Don't study that. You need to do this. Whereas now I think that's really, through people like yourself, it's opened up a whole new world of, actually, I can be interested in the history of witchcraft, and that's a legitimate period of history. That's a legitimate field of study, and it's so much more freeing. So I definitely think that's the case. And I would like to ask you, if that's okay, a little bit about witches and a little bit about the royal witches. So
Yes.
what I think would be worth doing, just for our listeners, is to give us a little overview of who these women were and kind of what they were accused of. I suppose this is more than just a little thing. This is quite a broad thing. And what characterized medieval witchcraft, because when we think of witchcraft, we think of the early modern period, we think of the witch trials, and we think of probably more modern examples like The Craft and Sabrina the Teenage Witch. But what is medieval witchcraft, and who were the royal witches?
Yeah, so the royal witches who are the topic of my first book are 4 women who married into the English royal family in the 15th century. So none of them were born into the English royal family, but they all came from different stations in life. Some of them were from the nobility, some of them were a bit lower down, but they all ended up being married to people who were either kings or princes, sort of heirs to the throne. And so they all found themselves right at the heart of power in 15th century England. And obviously, this is a very tumultuous period. You've got the wars with France at the start of the century. You've got new king on the throne who's overthrown the previous king. You have all of the seeds being sown for the Wars of the Roses, and then the Wars of the Roses themselves. So it's a really vicious, dangerous time for anybody to be at the court. And these women are no exception. And even though they are at various times the most powerful or one of the most powerful people in the country, they are not necessarily safe from their position. And what happens during this time is that notions of witchcraft are developing. So the thing that's quite interesting is that although the book is called Royal Witches, at the time of the first case in the book, which is Joan of Navarre, who was the wife of Henry IV, the word witch didn't exist. It wasn't a concept. If you'd asked any person in England what's a witch, they'd have been like, well, I don't know, what are you talking about? But by the time of the last case in the book, which is against Elizabeth Woodville, who's the queen of Edward IV, you have just a few years after the final accusations against her, you have the Malleus Maleficarum being published, which is the Hammer of Witches, this iconic key Germanic witch hunting manual, which is putting down on paper, this is a witch, this is how you identify them, this is what they look like, this is how they act, this is what they can do. And this is in the space of about 70 years or so really not a very long period of time. And basically in the 14th century in Europe, some ideas of witchcraft and magic had kind of been developing. This idea that people existed who could wield magic and they could use it to harm or influence people in some way. And so this had kind of become a convenient political weapon at various courts. It's a good way to get rid of a rival at court or an inconvenient person, is to accuse them of using evil magic. And so you come to the 15th century in England and this very tumultuous period, and you have inconvenient women at court or women who are connected to inconvenient men at court. And this suddenly becomes a very tempting weapon to use because of the nature of reputation being so entwined in the medieval period. If you want to get rid of someone, then look at the women in their lives, because they're a lot easier to dislodge than the men. And sort of by association, you then bring down the men. And so it's really interesting. So it's 4 women. So sort of mentioned Joan of Navarre and Elizabeth Woodville. You also have Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, who had married into the royal family as well. She had married one of the sons of Henry IV, and then a woman named Eleanor Cobham, who had married another son of Henry IV. And their lives all overlap. They all knew and lived alongside at least one other woman in the book, in most cases with multiple women. And yeah, it's really interesting seeing how the accusations against them develop alongside developing ideas of magic, and how the accusations against them are shaped by how understandings of magic develop, but also as the cases against them happen, that then shapes people's understanding of magic, because they see this happening against a high profile figure, and it changes what they know. And as you say, it's a very different time. It's not these mass witch hunt hysterias that you see in the early modern period. It's not a thing of, the weird little old lady in the village, accuse her kind of thing. There's different strands of magic. So you sort of have negromancy, which is black magic, also kind of known as necromancy, and this idea that you can summon the spirits of the dead. But this is very much a really skilled, learned magic. So this isn't something that anybody can do. You have to be a highly educated man to do this, to have access to all the books that you are able to read to learn how to do it. So this isn't something that anybody can be accused of. But, as time goes on, you do start to get these ideas of more emotional magic, which gets connected to women, things like love magic, which are kind of what you might expect more of witches, of the kind of idea of potions being made and wax figurines and things like that anybody can do. And it's very much connected to women, because whilst necromancy is sort of educated men who are learning things with books, you have love magic because women are emotional, and they want to resort to magic to make men fall in love with them, or to punish a spurned lover. And because we're all obsessed with men, of course, and that's the only way to do magic.
We are, yeah.
So it's really interesting, as I said, just seeing how it changes and develops over the period, and yeah, how it does inform these cases, and the very different fortunes and outcomes of the women, and what they're accused of as well.
Yeah, I find, because another thing that you wrote about, and in fact we discussed this in another episode, and I just thought about this, and you were saying about men thinking that we were obsessed with them, which is mercifully that hasn't traveled into the modern day at all. But hey, everything's for the male gaze. But I was sort of rather excited to see that you'd written about Malleus Maleficarum, which is, not my go-to, because I don't think that can be your go-to, can it really? Unless,
average Friday night.
Yeah, unless you're going to raise some eyebrows. But, thinking about Helena and thinking about Cramina and things, I find this fascinating, kind of this sort of kind of intense focus on the sexuality that came later. And it's interesting, I thought extraordinarily so, actually, when you were talking about the idea that the word witch is so familiar to us now, how that has changed over time, and how that had no familiarity at all earlier on, and then as things started to change. And of course the fact that, I know Malleus Maleficarum was, again, sort of 15th century in the printing press and everything else, but it's interesting how the frenzy started more so kind of when we're thinking about probably like the 17th century, aren't we, really, when we're starting to think when these things really start kind of kicking off with maybe the fame is the wrong word, but the reputation, the notoriety that they have today. But it's so fascinating to me that there are other, as you say, the royal witches, these characters that, again, a lot of people maybe don't have any kind of knowledge of them being associated with witchcraft at all. And of course, being paid by the mention each time I say Anne Boleyn, but famously with charges there of witchcraft and these things that start being kind of bandied around because it fits the narrative, or of course someone's impotence, or somebody's gone off something, I liked her because of witchcraft, and you think, oh God, and it's still in the modern day, isn't it, this sort of narrative of that a woman could manipulate somebody into finding them attractive, and you're like, well, yeah, of course, let's lay it all at our door. But in terms of things like witchcraft, like Anne Boleyn, that kind of thing, how much do you think that in the general belief system that people actually really put any weight behind things like that, or do you think, as you were sort of explaining so articulately, that a lot of it is really fitting a narrative? And it's a convenient accusation rather than people going, no, I really was manipulated by witchcraft. Do you think it is just something that kind of suits the narrative, basically?
Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting, sort of with doing royal witches, and it's something that I do see online quite a lot now, where medieval is kind of used as a derogative thing,
Yes,
where
yeah.
if there's a law being passed, or opinions in politics, and people say, oh, it's so medieval, and it's like, actually in a lot of cases what you should be saying is, oh, it's so early modern. because actually a lot of it comes from there. And you do have, although these ideas are developing, there is a lot of skepticism that goes on, and a lot of scientific inquiry. And actually, the first chapter of the book is not about the women at all. It's looking at magic and science in the medieval period, and how things are looked at with a scientific lens, and there is healthy debate that goes on between people about whether things are real or true or not. So a really great example is astrology, which for a big period was viewed as a science. Doctors were expected to know astrology because it was accepted that the stars and the planets had influence on people, and so the course of your treatment would change based on the star signs, the planets, how it affected the person, things like that. You had every single court in Europe would have a court astrologer who would advise the kings. Even the Pope had astrologers at his court. So it's very much a scientific thing, but people still question things, because you did have people go, well, how can astrology be real when you have twins who live completely different lives? And then you had religious men going, well, if you're saying that, astrology is real and that's sort of guiding our lives, then, you're diminishing the role of God. You're not saying that God's in control of our lives. And so there are questions about these things. And there are lots of things that, we today think of as magic that were being investigated as scientific disciplines. So, like metallurgy and things like that, the sort of idea of transmuting materials from one thing to another. Monarchs across Europe were trying to figure out how to turn lead into gold, because gold's very useful because you need to pay people, and so they're hiring people to look into this, and although today we kind of, with our modern understanding, you kind of think of it as magic, but you can kind of understand the thinking, because if you look at scientific processes and how you can put two different elements together and get something completely different, it's when you don't understand atoms and things like that, the idea of, well, if you put these two completely different things together, you get something completely different, so why could we not do that and make one thing into another? And so people are looking at this with a scientific mind. And it's the same with witchcraft. Lots of people very much believe in it, and this gets stronger as time goes on, but people are still skeptical. As I said, it's not a time of mass hysteria, witch hunts, where people are pointing the fingers at anybody and seeing what sticks. If people are accused, there is there are trials, and the evidence is looked at, and things are assessed carefully, and people are not automatically sort of convicted and executed. And actually there's a lot of leniency that goes on. It's only in the Tudor period in England that witchcraft becomes a secular crime. Up to that point, it's a matter for the church. And so that's really important in the cases against these women, is, they're not being tried in the law courts as witches. They might have the church investigate them. But again, there's still a lot of debate, certainly in the earlier period, as these ideas are developing, of, well, can magic be real? Because, is it mentioned in the Bible? And, this idea kind of gets developed of it being connected to the devil, witches are getting their power from the devil and they're being bestowed with these things. But again, people are then questioning, well, God wouldn't let the devil have that kind of power. You know, God wouldn't let human beings wield these terrible forces. So, you know, is it heretical to believe in witches at all? You know, because actually you're questioning God's power there if you're saying that people have got these magical powers. So there is a lot of debate that goes on, and people don't blindly believe things, and people are not idiots. You know, they can see political accusations, and that's very much the case for some of the women in the book, particularly Joan of Navarre, in that, you know, most chroniclers who record her arrest don't record the reason. There's only one or two who mention, you know, that it was for sort of magical reasons, but most of them don't mention it at all. And, you know, she's been accused of using evil magic to try and kill the king, and you think that's scandalous. And you know, Eleanor Cobham, every single English chronicle mentions in great depth her trial, because it's the scandal of the age, it's the trial, you know, it's the OJ Simpson kind of, you know, televised event, yet for Joan, people are barely mentioning it. You know, some of the chronicles don't even mention her getting arrested at all, and then most of the ones that do, it's just a one line kind of, oh yeah, and then, you know, Joan was put away kind of thing. And you know, I think that is great evidence to the fact that people probably did not believe that she had done anything wrong, because they haven't bothered to write about it. And so it's almost like a sort of implicit like acceptance of, well, you know, we all know that something else is going on here, and you know, her money's suddenly gone to the crown and she's living in a luxurious castle, and you know, none of this really adds up. So, you know, people were very much aware of it as a political tool as well. So I think it's very important to remember that, to remember those differences, because it is, as you say, it's 200 years before you have these things like the Salem witch trials and all of the really famous, you know, British ones as well. So it is earlier, and so it is a very different view of witchcraft to that people might be more familiar with.
Yeah, extraordinary. So that idea of like Pendle and all these things, but you know, in later centuries, and I'm so fascinated by that kind of sort of political notion, and as you say, it being you know, non-secular at that point. And it's interesting, this idea again that people, because like that previous point that you made so rightly, that people say medieval in a negative sense, but the fact people then, just as today, can kind of raise an eyebrow or see exactly what's going on, what's hidden in sort of plain sight behind trumped up charges or whatever things may be. And it's just interesting, because I think a lot of the time these, you know, anything to do with the word witch or witch trials and things, there's a caricature of what you instantly think of. And actually, tragically, in many instances, that sort of horrifying images were absolutely right. But I think the sort of the medieval side of it is more sort of political and different to what you expect. And certainly when we were starting the podcast as well, there was some research that I was doing, and I was fascinated again at just how various it was in a relatively short space of time, and kind of things changing probably after sort of James the First, you know, the things started to ramp up again. But I mean, that's for another episode, I'm sure. But yeah, it's fascinating. And it's I mean, I'm going to read your book, and I'm not just saying that because you're on the podcast, like 100%. And I'm also just going to say that I am going to, if they're still available, buy one of the mugs off your website as well, because they look so cool. I was like, don't they? Sorry, yeah. I think obviously I need something like that. I could talk to you forever. I think you are fabulous. And I don't say that lightly. But Amy, if you've got anything else to ask, I'm aware that we've kind of held you for ages, but I was just thinking if there's anything Amy wants to ask, but otherwise, you know, Jeremy, if you've got anything, kind of any talks or anything coming up you want people to kind of be aware of, or, you know, anything to sort of mention, our listeners are going to be very much on your side and interested. So do let us know if there's anything you kind of want to, I suppose, plug, because I'd love to know as well.
That was going to be what I was going to ask. So
I'm so
great
sorry.
Minds, great
God,
minds.
what she's sorry.
No. Literally, that was so. I could talk to you all evening. There's loads, and I definitely think we will
loads.
We'll get you on again particularly when your next book comes out, because I think that would be a really interesting thing to look into, and that's a real. Purely selfishly, that's a real grey area in my medieval history, so we'd love that. But where can we find you? Not literally, obviously, that's a bit creepy.
Amy, right. Play it cool, babe.
Where can our listeners find you? And if there's anything you want to plug, let people know. Now is your time.
Yeah, so I have my blog, Just History Posts, which is the website that you can find with lots of my more in-depth social media posts. I'm also on Blue Sky under Gemma H. Author, and I run a newsletter which I post about once a month, which is also under Just History Posts on Substack. And yeah, you can go find my books. I've got 3 of them out. They're available in bookshops, on Amazon, in sort of, England, USA, most English speaking countries, you can find them. And yeah, just go have a look. And yeah, I'll definitely have to come back because I feel like we've barely scraped the surface. So we'll definitely have loads more to talk about. But no, it's been really great and so interesting to hear your guys' perspective on everything as well.
I thank you, very kind. Honestly, I just think I was sort of hanging off what you were saying, and I was thinking, oh gosh, I was aware that we'd kind of held up your time quite a lot here, but yeah, just it's so extraordinary, it's so fascinating. But look, thank you so much. We will definitely get you on again. I'm relieved to hear it won't be kicking and screaming that you're willing to come back on, so we're very grateful to you. But yeah, have a look on Gemma's socials, and I cannot encourage enough having a look on the blog, because honestly, there's a Mappamundi that there's so much on there. So, and it's all in categories. It's very easy to navigate and fascinating reading. You've got to look. Loved it. Amy, you signed us in. Do you want to sign us out?
So thank you to everyone who has listened, and most importantly, thank you to Gemma for putting up with us for the time and sharing her knowledge. Honestly, it's been absolute bucket list. So thank you guys, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be speaking to you real soon.